The evening air in Hanam-dong carried a muted chill as winter threatened to settle in for its final weeks. Streetlights glowed warmly against a pale blue of dusk, illuminating the narrow roads where boutique cafes and quiet galleries stood in elegant stillness. Snow had not yet begun to fall, but the cold was sharp enough to catch in the breath of anyone walking past. It was in this delicate hour, when the day softened into night, that Hyun and son Ye-jin stepped into a discreet studio tucked between two minimalist buildings, a place chosen precisely because it allowed shadows to fall where no camera flashes could reach. From the outside, the studio looked deceptively ordinary: white brick walls, a single warm lamp above the entrance, faint hum of a heater inside. But for the small staff preparing lights and equipment within, there was nothing ordinary about what was about to happen. Tonight, for the first time since becoming icons of a modern fairy tale, the couple had agreed to speak openly about the parts of their marriage they had kept hidden, the struggles they had carefully shielded from the public eye. The mood was tender, respectful, but undeniably heavy, like the hush before a long-awaited confession. When the couple entered, it was impossible not to see how much the years had shaped them. Son Ye-jin moved with her signature calm elegance, wrapped in a winter coat the color of soft cream, her hair tied loosely as if she had not bothered with the usual glamour. Yet she looked radiant in a different way, more mature, more intentional, and with an expression that revealed she had prepared her heart for this conversation. Hyun walked beside her, dressed in a simple black coat, hands tucked in his pockets. His eyes, though warm, carried a weight that went deeper than the fatigue of a tight filming schedule. It was the look of someone who had lived through experiences that carved themselves quietly into the soul. They took their seats facing the interviewer, who greeted them softly, aware of the fragility in the air. The camera crew adjusted the lighting, creating a halo of warm tones around the couple, light that looked gentle, forgiving, almost symbolic. There was no dramatic entrance, no rehearsed cinematic moment. Instead, it felt like two people returning from a long journey, ready to set down the emotional luggage they had carried far too long. In the beginning, the questions were light, respectful. They discussed their latest projects, upcoming endorsements, and how life had changed since becoming parents. Their smiles in these moments were warm but practiced, a reflection of years spent answering such questions with grace. But then the interviewer's voice softened, shifting the direction of the conversation. "Fans always describe you as the perfect couple," she said gently. "Do you feel there has ever been pressure in living up to that image?" For a second, neither spoke. It was the kind of silence that contained a universe. Then Son Ye-jin exhaled slowly, as if releasing the first knot in a long tangle of memories. "Perfection is something we showed," she said softly, "not something we always lived." It was the beginning of the truth behind the glow. The world had adored their love story from the moment Crash Landing on You swept across Asia like a romantic storm. Fans fell in love with their on-screen chemistry, elegant visuals, their quiet gestures that felt so real it was hard to believe they were acting. When news of their relationship broke, the world celebrated as if a fictional romance had stepped off the screen into real life. Their wedding became the pinnacle of that fairy tale, an elegant ceremony bathed in white flowers and soft light, with the guests later describing it as a moment where you believe in destiny again. But destiny, as beautiful as it sounds, can protect anyone from the complexities of reality. After the glow of public adoration settled, a different kind of light took over, the harsh, unrelenting spotlight of fame. The couple described how they couldn't go on a simple walk without cameras flashing from every angle. Every outfit, every expression, every gesture became an article, a debate, a source of speculation. Even their silence was interpreted as a sign of something deeper, something wrong, something dramatic. "We couldn't even walk down the street holding hands," Hyun confessed, his voice low. "Not because we didn't want to, but because the world wouldn't let us be ordinary." Fame, in its glamorous cruelty, had a way of shrinking their personal lives. What fans saw were perfect photographs, flawless, tender, glowing. But what existed behind those images was a story that carried both beauty and hidden wounds. When their schedules began to collide, the cracks deepened. Between Hyunbin's action films and international promotions, and Ye-jin's dramas, advertisements, and motherhood responsibilities, time became a luxury they rarely possessed. There were weeks when their interactions were reduced to quick hugs between departures and returns, or short exchanges before collapsing into bed. Days when the most they shared was a simple note left in the kitchen or a sleepy smile exchanged in the early dawn. We were married, Ye-jin said quietly. But sometimes we felt like shadows passing each other. Interviewer asked softly. Was it difficult to communicate during that time? Her eyes lowered. We were too tired to fight. Too tired to talk. Too tired to fix anything. Hyun bin nodded, guilt flickering briefly across his face. When you're exhausted, silence feels easier than explaining how you feel. But silence, they soon learned, could be its own form of pain. Media scrutiny only intensified the pressure. Every time they attended an event together, analysts examined the distance between their shoulders, the angle of their smiles, the way they looked at each other for a fraction of a second. Entire articles were written about whether they seemed too stiff or too distant or too perfect to be real. The intensity of public attention forced them to perform happiness even on days when they struggled to feel it. It's strange, Hyun bin said with a faint smile of sadness. We acted for a living, but the hardest acting was pretending everything was fine. The worst wounds, however, rumors, uninvited, unfiltered, and unforgiving. Ye-jin recalled the sting of seeing tabloids speculate about her co-stars, twisting friendly professionalism into insinuations. Hyun bin remembered reading comments accusing him of being emotionally absent or more focused on fame than family, even if they knew the truth. They didn't believe the rumors fully. The questions they planted were seeds of doubt. You don't want to doubt the person you love, Ye-jin whispered. When the whole world constantly tells you a story, sometimes, you start to fear it. The interviewer noticed the way her hands trembled slightly. It wasn't for drama. It wasn't for effect. It was the tremble of someone remembering a quiet heartbreak. Then came the story neither had ever revealed before. Hyun bin returned home after a long shoot. It was nearly 3 a.m. The apartment was dark except for the dim glow of the hallway light. When he walked into the living room, he found Ye-jin sitting alone at the dining table, staring at nothing. Hands clasped together as if trying to hold herself steady. I asked if she was waiting for me, he said, voice heavy. She didn't answer. Ye-jin swallowed slowly, recalling the scene. I wasn't angry. It was just empty. They sat across from each other in silence that night, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know how to reach one another through the exhaustion and the noise of fame. It was the moment I realized we were breaking, Ye-jin said softly. Hyun bin nodded. And the moment I realized I didn't want to lose her. Their confession hung in the air like a fragile truth finally spoken aloud. The glow that fans adored had been real. It had also been a shield, one they hid behind to protect themselves from the world's expectations. But shields, no matter how bright, cannot stop hearts from cracking under pressure. As the first part of the interview came to an end, the room remained still, as though honoring the raw intimacy that had just unfolded. Dimmed slightly, casting soft shadows on their faces, shadows that no longer felt like something to hide, but something to acknowledge. The cameras resumed after the short break. The studio lights seemed warmer than before, casting gentle amber tones across Hyun bin and Sun Ye-jin's faces. The heaviness of the first part of their revelation still lingered in the air. But something had shifted. The vulnerability they had exposed earlier, instead of weighing the room down, now created an unexpected softness, like the moment after a storm when the wind calms and the clouds begin to separate. The couple sat closer, shoulders nearly touching, as if sharing their truth had pulled them back into the same emotional gravity. The interviewer noticed a subtle change immediately. There was less tension in their posture, less guardedness in their expressions. It was as though the very act of speaking about their struggles had cleared space between them, space once filled with silence, fear, and pressure. Now, space held something gentler, possibility. Oh, how did you begin to heal? The interviewer asked, her voice tender, aware of the weight behind the question. Jin glanced at Hyun bin before answering, the corners of her lips lifting into a small, reflective smile. Doesn't start with big gestures, she said softly. It starts with noticing the small things again. Those small things had been lost somewhere along the way, buried beneath filming schedules, overseas shoots, parenting anxieties, and the exhausting expectations of showbiz. It was those very ordinary moments that eventually pulled them out of the quiet darkness, threatening to swallow their marriage. People described the night everything changed, a night neither of them had shared publicly until now. After the silent week that followed their emotional disconnect, they reached an unspoken breaking point. Hyun Bin recalled coming home late one evening, unsure if he would find an empty apartment or the distant presence of a wife he no longer knew how to approach. Instead, he found Ye-jin waiting on the balcony, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the city lights. "I didn't know if she wanted to talk or if she wanted more space," he admitted. "But I went to stand beside her anyway." I didn't turn to him right away. They stood there in silence, side by side, watching the city shimmer in shades of amber and blue. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Or she finally whispered, "We can't keep living like this." It was the moment honesty finally broke through the walls they had built between them. They talked at night until the city fell asleep. Spoke in fragmented sentences at first, soft, shaky, careful. Eventually, spilled out freely, frustration, fear, regret, longing. Cried separately, then together. They admitted the ways they had failed each other, the ways they had failed themselves. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation. Jin said. It was gentle, painful, necessary. That night that they would not give up, not on each other, not on their marriage, not on the love that had once brought them peace. So began the slow, quiet work of healing. One of the first changes they made was learning to speak again, not as celebrities, not as symbols, but as two imperfect humans navigating the fragile terrain of marriage. They started leaving handwritten letters for each other. Were long confessions, others were simple reminders of affection. Sometimes, Hyun Bin shared with a small laugh. He would leave a note in my jacket pocket that just said, "Eat well today." And it meant everything. They also carved out sacred time for themselves, mornings at the kitchen table sharing a warm drink, walks by the Han River at dawn. With no phones, no scripts, no expectations. These were small rituals. But they began stitching their bond together stitch by delicate stitch. Media pressure didn't vanish, but the couple learned to stop letting it dictate their emotional reality. Tabloids published speculations about marriage cracks. The two no longer scrambled to fix their image. Instead, they learned to laugh at headlines that exaggerated details of their public appearances. They stopped performing perfection and embraced authenticity instead. "Realized we don't owe anyone a fairy tale," Ye-jin said gently. "We only owe each other the truth." Still, healing wasn't linear. They stumbled. There were nights they disagreed. Days their schedules clashed. Moments when past wounds resurfaced. But they fought through these moments not as icons trying to maintain an image, but as partners trying to preserve a home. One of the stories that moved fans the most was their trip to Jeju Island, a quiet escape that became the turning point in their healing journey. They stayed in a small guest house overlooking the sea. Jeju's winter ocean roared against the cliffs as though mirroring the turbulence they had endured. On their second night, in scarves and coats, they sat by the shore with only the moon as witness. It was cold, Hyun Bin recalled, but sitting beside her, felt warm. Spoke about their fears, his fear of not being enough, her fear of losing herself in public expectations. They spoke until their breaths formed white clouds in the night air. At one point, Hyun Bin cried, not out of weakness, out of the overwhelming realization that he had forgotten how to let himself be vulnerable with her. When he cried, Ye-jin whispered, "Remembered why I fell in love with him." From that night, their healing deepened. They promised to let go of perfection, to choose honesty over silence, connection over pride. They promised to listen, to apologize without hesitation, show affection even on difficult days. Being happy together, and said softly, became more important than looking happy to the world. The interviewer, visibly moved, had a long pause before asking how they felt now that the world knew their truth. Hyun Bin answered first, voice steady but tender. "Relieved," he said. "Lived with a glow for so long, it feels good to show the shadows too." Ye-jin nodded with a quiet smile. "Stronger now. Not because we avoided pain, but because we faced it." The story of their confession began spreading across the internet even before the interview concluded. Clips from their conversation went viral, Ye-jin's trembling voice as she spoke of loneliness, Hyun Bin's steady tone as he admitted his fear of losing her. The moment their hands found each other unconsciously, fans around the world left comments expressing shock, sympathy, and admiration. "I thought they were perfect," one fan wrote. But now I admire them more for being real. Oh, hid the pain. Another commented. But the truth shows their strength. Others expressed gratitude that the couple's honesty helped normalize the fact that even the most beautiful marriages carry shadows. But perhaps the most touching reactions came from married fans who saw themselves reflected in the couple's struggles. They wrote messages about feeling unseen, unheard, overwhelmed, and how Ye-jin's vulnerability encouraged them to open conversations with their own partners. In that sense, their revelation became larger than a celebrity confession. It became a mirror through which others examined their own relationships. As the interview drew to a close, had fully enveloped the city. Snow began to fall lightly outside, dusting the studio windows in delicate flakes. Hyun stood and offered Ye-jin his hand. She took it naturally, with the ease of someone who had rediscovered the warmth of a familiar home. When they walked out into the Seoul night, they didn't rush. They moved slowly beneath the soft snowfall, steps aligned, breaths visible in the cold air. Weren't performing. They weren't posing. They weren't trying to live up to an image. They were simply two people in love, weathered, softened, and still choosing each other. Silhouettes disappeared into the gentle blur of snow and streetlight. But the message they left behind lingered long after the screen faded to black. The truth behind the glow wasn't darkness. It's humanity. And in that honesty, their love found its light again.